Thank you very much for the invitation. It's really an interesting opportunity for me to learn a bit more about of the work of other people working on this kind of interface between refugee studies and ignorance studies. So I'll be talking today about my book project, which has the same title as my presentation, well, what I've heard so far is really interesting, especially because I'm also kind of implicitly grappling with this question of what is intended, what is unintended, how to conceptualize that, how to prove it. So I'm really interested in this. Unfortunately, I can't be participating in as many as the sessions as I would like to, also due to teaching, as Natasha also indicated. So but at least it's great to be part of this panel. What I hope to do in the 15 minutes that I have is, well, it's a whole book. So it's going to be inevitably kind of a summary of that. I want to say something about why I studied the question of refugee governance in Lebanon and what that has to do with ignorance, apart from my own ignorance of the topic in the beginning. And then just, I think, really present the main framework or the main conclusions of the thesis of the book, and then dwell a little bit more on the link with ignorance studies, because I think that's what's kind of tying us together conceptually. And then I'm really looking forward to discussion. That's going to be great. So why studying refugee governance in Lebanon? Well, governance is particularly interesting to study in Lebanon because, I mean, there's a whole lecture to be held there. There's no time, but it's a particularly complex and very interesting political system, sectarian consociationalism based on hybrid state and non-state authorities. So governance in general is particularly interesting there. Studying refugee governance there is even more interesting because Lebanon is the country with the highest per capita number of refugees in the world today. There's an estimated 1.5 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon, as well as an estimated 200,000 Palestinian refugees. And these are also the two refugee communities that I'll be talking about a bit more now. So my research specifically focused, it was two different projects, a PhD project which focused on the relations between informal or the self-proclaimed leaders of informal refugee settlements of Palestinian communities around Sur, so Tyre here, and then a postdoc project that studied basically the similar question of the relations between local authorities of Syrian refugees and local Lebanese authorities in informal settlements around Zahle here in the Bekaa Valley. And I think it's insightful to share a bit with, you know, where does the ignorance come into this story of refugee governance. Well, when I started doing my research on Palestinian refugee communities, it soon became clear that these relations between Lebanese state authorities and Palestinian refugee authorities were very informal, very irregular, very ad hoc, very politicized. And all of that surprised me at first, because I thought these people have been here for 70 years. This could have been more regulated, which is of course a very naive kind of Weberian fiction to begin with. But it was interesting because some of my interlocutors also made that observation, and they pointed out that kind of the continuing informality and exceptionalism that they face as a community was not entirely contingent or structural, that this also served purposes of both Lebanese and Palestinian authorities that were supposedly representing them. So this is a citation that really got me thinking of a Lebanese, Palestinian youth leader who said, the situation here of what we can expect, we can turn to what our rights are. It's totally clouded and unclear, and it's meant to be cloudy. We're not supposed to understand this. And then a Palestinian legal analyst basically said something similar, saying there is no official Lebanese responsibility for Palestinians on any level, and it's intended to be vague. And the main gist here is that by not making any formal rules, by not having any formal mandates or any formal authorities recognized, this creates a lot of discretionary power that works in the benefits of authorities on both sides and not to the benefit of the refugee communities. So that was kind of an inductive thing that came up in my PhD research. I never set out to study this, but it did resonate at the time with the stories of the Lebanese response to the Syrian refugee crisis, where the term "no policy" was one of the buzzwords, especially in the beginning, and that really resonated with what I found with Palestinian refugees. So in the follow-up project, I studied this a bit more deductively and looked at, okay, in this context where there is no policy, what does that mean for the relations between Syrian representatives of informal refugee communities and Lebanese authorities? And I found that basically, well, there was a first period of no policy making at all. And then that was remedied, but there was a kind of a negative policy making based on what they called a set of no's. So they said, there's no refugees. There were refugees, 1.5 million, but we just don't call them refugees. We don't give them refugee status, so we don't have to deal with them. Then they said there's no camp, that the second no. They were all self-settled, which basically meant abandoned. And then again, that ignored the fact that there were thousands of informal camps, as you can also see on this picture, but they had no formal status. They were not UN camps. They were not state camps. So again, they could be disregarded or ignored. And then there was a third no, saying these people have no representatives, which was basically deliberately kept that way by authorities who did not recognize informal leaders and imposed, in fact, securitized intelligence interaction between refugee communities and local state authorities. And here, this resulted in confusion, frustration, insecurity, uncertainty with refugees. I'm not gonna read this out loud. This is of course a big no-no, this long quote on a slide. But it is to indicate that refugees have no idea what they need to do, for instance, in this case, to get a formal refugee status. And that also the authorities that are supposedly guiding them there have no idea either of what that should look like. And then it's not just refugees who are ignorant or stupid or whatever, who don't get it. And it's also the supposed humanitarian experts that really don't understand what the policy is supposed to be about, as this citation shows. So all of this resulted in confusion and unpredictability. Unclear policies, uncertain governance situations, irregular institutions were kind of the basic characteristic of the way that Lebanon governs Syrian and Palestinian refugees. So that became kind of the key interest for my book project. How and why does this uncertainty emerge? And there's various reasons, of course, there are always various reasons. Some people claim that's just because refugees don't get it. They're complex, intricate systems, but refugees don't understand them. I don't think I have to elaborate on why that's very unconvincing. Then the other thesis is, of course, that the very fact of displacement, conflict-induced displacement, inevitably and inherently creates confusion, chaos, unpredictability, which is definitely true. On top of that, refugees are often hosted, as is the case in Lebanon, by countries with a lot of institutional problems, weak capacity to deal with any governance challenge, let alone such a big refugee crisis, which is also certainly true. But the thesis of my book is that that's not all of it, that this unpredictability and uncertainty are also kept in place, sometimes strategically, because it serves clear interests of ruling elites in dealing with refugees. And I've tried to conceptualize that as well, apart from showing it through a lot of vignettes and case studies. So what my book aims to do is offer a kind of a heuristic framework of how such institutional ambiguity that refugees face, what it looks like. And then there's a focus on three dimensions: the informality, so the fact that refugee status, refugee shelter, and refugee representatives are often deliberately not recognized by state institutions. Doesn't mean they don't engage with them, but they don't engage with them in an official, formal way. Similarly, or this is often done under a guise of liminality, so to deliberately keep in place the temporariness of the refugee presence, even when this is extremely protected, with, as is the case with Palestinian refugees. The excuse of continuing informality is that this is, in essence, a liminal temporary situation. And then that results in exceptionalism on a legal and spatial front, where refugees are excluded from any formal governance system. Oh, wrong way. So how does that emerge? So I've been interested also to theorize, like, how does such institutional ambiguity come to be? And I think it's two main things. It's, on the one hand, governance inaction, policy inaction, simply not making policies, not acting on policies, but also ambiguous action. So producing confusing through vague mandates, vague formulations, incomplete and inconsistent policies, partial and arbitrary implementation. I'll say a bit more about that. And then the question of, what does that mean then? Well, this results, or it helps authorities, as I show in the book, in three main ways. It helps, it produces the kind of uncertainty and fundamental confusion that helps control refugees. It undermines concerted agency and collective action to mobilize against the situation that they're in, the vulnerability that is imposed on them. At the same time, it enables exploitation. It creates a lot of discretionary power because refugees are excluded from their rights and therefore are totally at the mercy of different kind of Lebanese authorities, whether they are landlords, employers, or political authorities in any aspect of life. And it importantly also enables expulsion, in the sense that all of these measures are also very much in line with the Lebanese authorities' discourse that return of refugees is the key priority of any policy that they make. So a politics of uncertainty then produces a form of institutional ambiguity that manufactures vulnerability to help authorities control, exploit, and expel refugees. That sounds very simple and clean, and of course that's not the entire story. There's a lot of disclaimers to be made with regard to the political system in Lebanon, and a lot of these forms of inaction and ambiguous action are actually contingent on that system and not particular to refugee governance. But so we're not talking about some kind of masterminded chaos here, but it is my thesis in the book to show that part of this is indeed strategic and aligns with the stated and unstated interests of these elites. I was gonna give an example of how that works. I think I'm gonna skip it with an eye to the time, but we can always come back to that during the discussion, I think, to give a bit more feeling of how this mechanism works. But I want to also say something about where the ignorance studies actually comes into this, because confusion and uncertainty are not the same, obviously, as ignorance. But drawing on ignorance studies, specifically on agnotology, my idea of a politics of uncertainty sees institutional ambiguity as a particular form of epistemic politics, namely agnopolitics. It's a term coined by Davies and colleagues in discussing European governance of refugees, actually. And that works then in two ways, drawing on Lindsay McGui's work, offensive ignorance on the one hand, so imposing this uncertainty and informality on refugees and those trying to help them and those trying to represent them is imposing a form of not knowing or unknowing on them through absent policies, through vague formulations, and through unpredictable implementations that make that refugees cannot claim their rights, are subject to discretionary power, and cannot collectively plan and mobilize against, well, they don't know what against. That's exactly the point. But interestingly, imposing such unknowing is not is also often done through defensive ignorance. So it's not just authorities saying, well, we know the rules, but we're not going to share them with you, so you're confused and can't organize. It's a bit more complicated because they themselves, authorities themselves, often claim uncertainty and not knowing themselves. They feign and maintain their own ignorance to legitimize the no policies that they impose on refugees. For instance, by creating vague mandates that allow them, that kind of blur responsibility and accountability, by de facto outsourcing and decentralizing, that has the same effect, and by undermining and contesting the generation and production of information. For instance, in Lebanon, because there is no refugee registration and because the UN is not allowed to register refugees, there is no undisputed number of Syrian refugees. Authorities don't know officially how many people there are, and arguably they don't want to know because it's very convenient for them to be able to use different numbers vis-a-vis different audiences. I can also elaborate on that a bit more. I'd be really interested, and this is kind of the last part of my book. I also try to extend this thesis a bit beyond refugees and a bit beyond Lebanon, because I think it's very similar dynamics can be seen in Europe. But let's discuss that more. My main point here is that the informality, liminality, and exceptionalism that refugees face in Lebanon in terms of status, shelter, and representation, they are, yes, contingent on displacement itself. They are contingent on the institutional weakness of the host state, but they're also strategically reproduced to serve state authorities' aims in terms of control and return, and also their unstated interest in terms of exploitation. Thanks a lot for your time and attention, and I'm looking forward to the next presentation.